Take it away.
Okay, so I know almost everyone knows Ted, but a little bit about his background. He's a security operations manager for a leading global life sciences company. And he's responsible for the standardization, implementation of a global security program. He's worked in corporate security for leading healthcare organizations for almost 30 years. And he's overseen all aspects of an organization's public safety initiatives. He's an expert in conducting security plans for special events, high target facilities, and hospitals. He's a subject matter expert in several areas within industrial security, including workplace violence, physical security integration, risk mitigation, and crisis management. Working with state health organizations, partnered healthcare systems, and regulatory commissions, he has helped to define industry standards in several areas, including responding to violence in the workplace. So there, you didn't know what an expert we had in our midst. So today, Ted is talking about how to deal with an active shooter. So welcome, Ted.
Thank you. Marie, I have a, oh, I can just share my screen. If I can find my slide. All right. So as David said, I as a security leader, one of my responsibilities has always been applying some foreseeability to the operations as a whole, especially when you're talking about large organizations that serve one state or many states or even the entire globe. So back in the 1990s, when the school shootings were becoming more popular and increasing in rate, one of the things that I took on as an initiative on my own was putting together a active shooter, or what we called active violent event program for one of Minnesota's largest healthcare organizations, because we had nothing in place to deal with this. And back then, the goal was to try and prevent this from happening. Obviously, that's not the case today. It's more about mitigating the potential and, if possible, trying to minimize the number of victims and deaths that occur as a result of a catastrophic event like this. So forgive me if my slide presentation seems a little off. It's typically about an hour, so I had to cut it down. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the term active assailant. That's being used now quite often. Active shooter, active assailant, pretty much the same thing. The only difference is the method of killing. Active assailants utilize other sources to kill with: knives, swords, cars, whatever. So this has morphed a little bit over the years. So the terminology is going to change probably as these things continue to happen. So what is an active shooter? An active shooter is an individual that is actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill as many people as possible in a confined space and in a highly populated area. And the majority of times, active shooters use firearms, and those firearms are an assortment. Could be semi-automatic, fully automatic, whatever they can get their hands on, basically. But the incident locations are typically described as soft targets. These are locations like back in the day when schools had their doors wide open. They had hallways that you could see from one end to the next. Those are soft targets. Those are targets that are easily accessible with a large population of people and a lot of easy targets based off the design of the school itself. So you might notice that schools are changing the way they are building their buildings now. They're actually renovating a lot of buildings to eliminate that, and also creating more locked areas, locking the front doors, things like that, to mitigate this potential from happening as it has in the past. Active shooter incidents are very unpredictable. They evolve very quickly. Law enforcement, typically, when these first started happening, law enforcement would show up. The beat cops would show up. They would wait for the SWAT team or the CERT team, and then they would enter. Obviously, that was not a good method to operate with. So now the standard is, when there's an active shooter, law enforcement, the street cops show up, they immediately have to go in, regardless of how many show up. So the first officer on the scene is the lucky one who has to go in and try and eliminate the shooter as quickly as possible. Situations only last about 10, 15 minutes at the very most. They're very short. Basically, what we call them at some point is a cleanup, because there are going to be victims. There's going to be a lot of trauma. And the cleanup is a lot longer. It lasts a lot longer than the event itself, especially when it comes to clearing the crime scene. And this just shows kind of, and I'll give you a little background on how these statistics are collected. They're not collected. They're collected in silos, so everybody collects their own statistics. The sad part is there's no central depository for reporting these things. The FBI tracks them, the BCA tracks them. People track them differently. They don't share. So when it comes to looking at statistics, you're going to see that it's never going to be spot on. So this map is not doesn't wholeheartedly reflect the catastrophic events that have taken place across the United States. So again, these statistics are not going to be perfect because of the difficulty in obtaining them from all these different silos. But basically, the shootings and deaths, the injured and the total victims, the shootings and the deaths are never going to correlate, based on the fact that not everybody who gets shot dies. But the injured definitely will correlate to the two. And then the total victims in the end. You can see that since 2017, these incidences have not, they still haven't slowed down. And as a matter of fact, with COVID, when things were locked down, there was a very much a decline in active shooters, because nobody was out. They weren't out in malls. They weren't going to school. The only places that people truly were still congregating were healthcare facilities, places like that. And in a situation where you have states that are in lockdown, the chances of success in this horrific event are a lot slimmer. So there were fewer cases reported during COVID, but now, right after a lot of these lockdowns have been lifted and people are starting to move around and get back into schools, they're starting to go back up again, unfortunately. So they take place everywhere. The school system was basically the subject matter experts for a long time in this, because they were, their buildings were so confined. They had no locked doors. Again, they had hallways with line of sight from one end to the next. So like with Columbine and all these other schools, these horrific things took place because they were easy targets. So they even though it's not reflective here, education comes out to about 20.6. Commerce is bigger, but there's a lot of underreporting that happens within commerce. And if it's typically in commerce, if it's not a devastating event where there's a lot of victims, a lot of times it won't be reported. Education, it will be reported 99.9% of the time, because that's kids, it's children. Healthcare, the same thing, because again, you've got vulnerable adults, but a lot of these other places, they won't always be reported. So looking at this, I would say, you know, the main concerns here are education and healthcare. And open space is very rare based on the fact that there's very few active shooters that travel. There was a few recently that went on a crime spree or a shooting spree across a couple cities, killed a bunch of people. But again, that's not that doesn't fit the typical active shooter profile. They're looking for success in number of deaths, and that's what they're aiming for. So they're not going to always get that in open space. Open space, a lot of times you'll see people using cars, driving through a parade or something, kill as many people as they can with the car. It happens a lot in Europe with their outdoor Christmas events and stuff like that. So it's in residence is very few. Government, yeah, there's not a lot. There's a few at the military bases across the United States, but not a lot. So some of the most deadly, the top 4 most deadly modern U.S. history was Las Vegas. Obviously, the guy that went up into the suite. He was a active gambler. He's been there many, many times. Knew the layout. He picked it. He knew there was going to be an event. He had more guns than he needed. He had more ammo than he needed. He had IEDs. He had cameras set up. It was quite elaborate. So he spent many weeks on planning that attack. The Orlando shooting at Pulse nightclub, that was again a bad one, but that was odd because it was a hostage situation at some point, and he claimed allegiance to ISIS or something to that effect. So you know, we don't always know. Nobody always knows what their motive is, because typically they're ready to die at the end of their killing spree. Virginia Tech, that was another interesting one. He traveled around the campus and killed a bunch of students and instructors in 2 separate attacks, and then he was killed by the police. But he was another one who had a lot of red flags prior, and a lot of those red flags were just ignored. Sutherland Springs, Texas, November 5th. Again, another one. He actually had his tactical gear on, semi-automatic rifle, opened fire in a church. And then he ran out of the church, obviously, and was killed in a brief car chase. No motive for that. Well, typically there's 4 commonalities amongst these perps. There's a lot of childhood trauma exposure to violence at a young age. At some point, they reach a situation in their life where living is no longer worth it, and there's some people that may have pissed them off along the way. And unfortunately, to get from point A to point B, they go through anybody they have to get to their target. And most of the shooters, it's like any other killing out there, there's a lot of copycats. Unfortunately, early on, the media, based off of their reporting, has been considered to glorify a lot of this. And now you'll see they don't even really mention the name of the shooter like they used to. They used to plaster the face and the name all over the place. That's notoriety for these people. These are things they want. They want to go out in a blaze of glory. They want their picture all over the news. They want to be well known after it's all said and done, regardless of whether they're dead or alive. So that's a pretty sad state. But obviously, media has obviously the media has altered the way they report on these things, which is very good. And of course, they all had plans to carry out their shootings. They have obtained weapons. They determined their shooting site and the accessibility of the site. And again, soft targets. They're easy to get to, and if you can conceal your weapons, they're in. So a lot of people talk about prevention of future shootings, and again, you're not going to prevent these things from happening. There's too many unknowns out there, especially when it comes to adolescents. Adolescents are, unfortunately, some of the more complicated shooters. Adolescents typically, there is a profile that fits both at some point, and adolescents are typically, as a result of bullying, or I'd say there's about 75% of adolescents that were reported as being bullied, adolescent shooters, and as a result, it just, this is their action in the end. They just felt there was no other option for them. They felt that revenge was the only way to go, and this was the way to do it. And of course, you look back and see what other people have done. So you typically, you know, a lot of the similarities between the shooters actually exist. So we know that they have done their research. They all do their research. The fact of the matter is, during their research, during their preparation, there's always leakage. And leakage is basically sharing information to a third party. And sometimes they actually seek out others to join their cause, to go in on this with them. And very rarely do you see two shooters. And obviously that did happen in a couple of the incidents within the education, within the school systems. But you know, most of the time they don't find validation in what they're doing, so they just go ahead and do it on their own. It's up to us to make it more difficult for potential perpetrators to find validation. And it's also up to us to report red flags. And unfortunately, red flags are rarely reported. In a majority of these situations where the shooter was preparing for this horrific event, they leaked this. 41% of concerning behavior involving active shooters was reported to law enforcement before the incident, and nothing was done. Each active shooter displayed 4 to 5 concerning behaviors prior to the incident. And with adolescents, it's typically with school officials. Those behaviors are displayed to school officials or their peers. And it's up to folks that see these red flags to report them. At least one person noticed a concerning behavior in every active shooter's life. And on average, from 3 different groups noticed concerning behaviors for each active shooter. Critically, 25% of the person noticing the behavior was law enforcement. Unfortunately, not everything was followed up on at the time. So again, red flags need to be reported, and they need to be addressed immediately prior to allowing this to continue. Leakage is a big thing because every active shooter leaks information. Every active shooter has done that, and whether it be through social media or through text, whatever, these things need to be reported. Even if it's someone saying that they just had constantly having these feelings. I mean, any little red flag, it's up to us to report these things to law enforcement or officials that's where it's appropriate. So they spend 77% spent about a week or longer planning their attack. And in terms of planning, they're looking at their targets. They're going to the location, they're scoping it out. The majority of them have either worked there or were a student there, so they already knew. The only thing they needed to figure out was how are they going to, get this attack done and accomplish their goals. So they do their homework, and it's not just someone waking up one day saying, I'm going to go out and start shooting. They have to do preparation. And a lot of times they're looking at obtaining their firearms, they're practicing shooting, they're becoming more distant at the same time. to friends, family, and the outside world. And they're also collecting any other gear they need. And these days they're putting together IEDs because the goal is to kill as many people as possible. So if you can't get it done the way you have it planned, then what they want to do is they want to also attack the first responders. So IEDs have been set up in the past to even after their death to kill first responders that have entered the scenario to eliminate the shooter. Very few were diagnosed with mental disorders. Actually, about 25% were actually diagnosed with mental disorders. So this tells you that it's not a mental health issue all the time. And they always exhibit concerning behaviors. It's up to us to understand what those behaviors are. There's always a grievance. They always have a grievance at some point, whether it be employment action against them, bullying, whatever, what have you. My girlfriend just broke up with me, things like that. It just sets them off. They're already on their way down that path. It's just something that sets them off, flips the switch, and they go. So this may not apply to everybody, but this is one thing that I've done for a large organization is in terms of preparedness and response. The one thing that I brought forth and teach is the fact that an organization first must define violence. You have to define violence on your own for your own organization. Then you develop an overarching policy, especially in a large organization. You can't have 99 different policies. You have to have one policy that covers all of this, includes all your stakeholders, and transfers ownership at the same time. And then develop individual procedures for a healthcare organization. You have hospitals, you have medical clinics, you have EMS spaces, you have retail pharmacies, you have hospice houses, you have all these types of things. So you have to develop individual procedures for each business unit. So that procedure actually applies to their environment, so they can take action and reference that overarching policy if need be. And then environmental preparations is one thing that schools have really taken the lead on. It's one thing that I really did a lot of research on with the education with schools, is the fact that you have to put physical, you have to prepare your environment physically as well, to not only allow your first responders to get in and mitigate this as quickly as possible, but to allow your employees to do the same thing. So things like go packs, those are typically things that we put together, like floor plans, access cards, keys, whatever your first responders need when they get to the front door, and give them the resources they need to get in and eliminate the shooter as quickly as possible. But then you have to educate people. Education is probably one of the biggest keys out there. You have to educate people. You have to tell them what this is. It has to be very succinct, very clear, and it can't flow into some other policy or procedure within your organization. It has to be very clear as to what this is. And then three-stage development to test readiness. That is how do you prepare your organization? You have to do drills. You have to educate along the way. And it's not about, a lot of organizations I've seen have just contacted law enforcement and said, we want to come in, we want to do a full-fledged active shooter drill. We want you to come in and join us. So law enforcement comes in, they get their tactical gear on, they set it up, it's all coordinated. It's a very, it's a very public event at that point, because now you have, your facility is just inundated with law enforcement and law enforcement vehicles. So it's not really a good PR move unless you have a plan and you have a communication plan as well. So prior to getting to the full scale physical drill, I always advocate that you have to do smaller drills within your organization to include your risk folks, your C-suite, your emergency management, your leadership, so everybody knows exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish. And then at the end of all that, when you've come to the conclusion that you're ready, then you look at a full-scale drill. So what can we do as individuals in everyday life? I mean, we've had shootings at South Point Mall now. I think there was like 3 of them in the last year. We need to practice situational awareness, be mindful of your surroundings at all times, identify objects. And again, it's happening a lot more people are actually finding backpacks and bags laying out in the public area. So they actually call law enforcement. The area is secured and it's addressed appropriately. And one thing I would never recommend is you never leave your suitcase in the bathroom of don't ever abandon your suitcase in the bathroom of an airport. That's not a good idea. So you have to trust your instincts, trust yourself when you go out, what's around you. Look at your exit points. When you go to a movie theater, there's 2 ways to get out of that movie theater typically. Know how you're going to get out of that movie theater. You have to be really mindful of this because it's very unpredictable. The world now is more unpredictable than it has been in the past. And then add ICE to your phone. You scroll to the letter I in your phone contact list. Put your emergency ICE contact with the word ICE prior to the name. That's very important because that's how law enforcement are going to reach anybody in the event of something like this when it comes to trying to identify who to contact on your behalf. And then report suspicious behavior. That's the biggest thing. We don't do that enough, reporting suspicious behavior. After every one of these, the shooter's life comes out on the news, and there was always something that somebody knew, but they didn't say anything. And that's one of the most detrimental things to prevention or I guess, preventing this from escalating, these behaviors, is not paying attention to social media, not taking it seriously, basically. Someone looks at a Facebook post, someone is talking about killing people, they chuckle at it, but no, you shouldn't chuckle at it, you should probably call somebody. So typically the standard nationally is run, hide, fight. So if you get involved in an active shooter situation, the first response always is to run, have an escape route and plan in mind. And of course, that's not always going to be easy because when you have someone roaming a building, shooting people, you don't want to run into that shooter. So you got to plan your escape route, leave all your belongings behind, don't take anything, and keep your hands visible. You don't want your hands, your pockets, you don't want anything in your hand. You want your hands visible because law enforcement's coming to that. They don't know who the bad guy is. There could be more than one bad guy. Nobody knows anything, basically. So when you do get in front of a law enforcement official, you have your hands in the air and you're making your way out as quickly as possible. Second option is to hide, and hiding, behind a solid wall is more successful in terms of survival. Whether it be a closet, whatever, a door that you can lock, close the blinds, anything like that. So you're not noticed, you're not seen. Your phone should be on mute. So your phone doesn't give you away if you have to hide. You have to be a mouse, basically. Just hide and don't come out unless you feel that you can come out. But typically, when it gets to that point, you're staying in there for the long term, and you're waiting for law enforcement to come in and acknowledge the fact that it's clear to come out. And last resort is fighting. A lot of people have a hard time with this. When I've taught this to clinicians, they don't want to do this. It's very difficult, but at some point, if you have to fight for your life, you have to fight for your life, whether it be using any object you can get your hands on. If you're confronted by an active shooter, I wouldn't hesitate. Fire extinguishers are great. They do 2 things. You can hit them with it. You can also blind them with it. Chairs, whatever you can find, anything to incapacitate the attacker and get out as quickly as possible. So when law enforcement arrives, historically, they would arrive and wait. but they don't do that anymore. So the first officer on the scene goes in, every officer after that goes in. They're all equipped with the right tactical gear in their cruisers. They're set for this event or any event that's similar to this. And that was changed after Sandy Hook because it took too long for first responders to get in the door and go after the shooter. So to mitigate the casualty numbers, they changed the practice. Another thing that they're doing now is historically when law enforcement would go in, they basically you can't expect them to do anything other than track down the shooter and eliminate that person. So they're stepping over the wounded, they're stepping over dead bodies. One thing that you don't do if you're injured in a situation like that is you try and grab at the first responders. They're not. Their goal right now is to eliminate the threat and then triage. They can't do both at the same time. So that's one thing that's hard for a lot of people, and it's hard for law enforcement, to walk over someone who's bleeding to death, but they don't have a choice. They're obviously going to be wearing a combination of patrol uniforms, vests, tactical equipment, and they may have EMS. Some EMS do actually go in with them on the tail end. So they may have some EMS folks behind them doing some triaging, immediate triaging. So that does help. But right now, what they're doing is they're being taught how to deal with hemorrhage. It's called Stop the Bleed. So they're also being taught a lot of first responder medical training, so they can also apply tourniquets. They can also do things to prevent death, because typically what happens is people bleed out in this event wherever they're laying and they die. So one of the big things that's happening now is there's a lot of training across the nation taking place where officers are being taught how to stop the bleeding. They're being given the resources to do it so they can apply it and move on to the next, to prevent the number of deaths as a result of the shooting. They're going to be armed with guns. Obviously, they're going to have everything they need, flashbangs, tear gas, and they're going to be making a lot of noise. But basically, they're going to push through the scene to get to the shooter. So what you do is you keep your hands where they need to be, out in the open, and just trust in the fact that someone's going to be back to help. Remain calm. Put down any items in your hands. You shouldn't even be carrying any items in your hands, really, and keep them visible. Avoid making quick movements. These guys they're on edge right now. There's a lot of anxiety. Everybody's on edge, so you have to make it easy for them to get in there and deal with it. Don't scream, don't point, don't yell, don't try and stop them and ask them for directions. Just head in the direction they're telling you to go, and get out of there, because they've got other things that they're trying to do at the same time for the rest of the people involved in the situation. When you provide information to law enforcement, you want to try and give as accurate of a location of the shooter as possible. If you know the number, provide that physical description if you know it. A lot of people don't because they're just hearing the bangs. The number of type of weapon, really it doesn't come down to whether it's a rifle or handgun, just how many weapons they have if you know that, and the number of potential victims. EMS needs to know. I mean, they're going to roll everybody out there anyway, but it's better that they know what they're looking at so they can prepare prior to showing up on scene and bringing the number of resources necessary to treat everybody. Some of the resources that are out there, and if there's a lot of people doing a lot of work around this. OSHA has been doing a lot of work. Joint Commission in terms of healthcare has been doing a lot of work. They're trying to identify new standards. So the healthcare facilities are accredited through the Regulatory Commission, and that's the Joint Commission. And what's happened there is that the Joint Commission has mandated that they do more around workplace violence in general and around this. So within their requirements annually, there's a lot more work that healthcare organizations have to do to prepare for something like this. So unfortunately, that doesn't apply to everybody. If it did, we'd probably have everybody's workplace would be a lot safer. But in this is not happening yet. OSHA's working on it, but OSHA has guidelines that are basically telling you that you have to provide a safe and secure environment for your employees in general. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security is always a great resource. They have a lot of good things out there, training materials and stuff like that. NFPA is a National Fire Protection Agency. They don't do a lot when it comes to stuff like this, but they do have some things out there that they're putting out, and of course that applies to organizations such as organizations that have to follow National Fire Code, and NFPA writes that. So in the end, the employers are doing better than they have in the past. Unfortunately, I still don't trust malls. I don't go to malls. I will not go to malls anymore. There's certain places I just won't go based off the fact that a lot of these types of things are increasing in other areas where they haven't been before. So to me, it's about picking and choosing where you want to go, and I know where I'm not going to go. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody? I guess that's it.
Thank you, Ted. This was very insightful. As someone who is often training groups of people in person, somewhere in the 20-30 range, I often do a safety message around, exiting the room, avoiding slip, trip, falls, etc. And I've added active shooter. I basically just try to create an awareness of what we would do, where we would go to hide or run, and what we would use to fight. Is there more I can and should be doing?
Well, I mean, basically, when it comes to what you're doing now, that you're really hitting the nail on the head. That's where it has to start. And what you can provide more resources to people, but really what it is, it's about getting this in front of people, getting them to understand that if you see something in someone's life that is troubling, then you should speak up and not be afraid to. One of the things that a lot of people are afraid to do is say something because they don't want to lose a friend, or they don't want to be labeled that person, or they don't want to be laughed at. That's not the case these days. It's all about, if you see something that could be a potential future issue or could boil into something bigger, because people's patterns of behaviors change. And when someone starts becoming isolated and dark, those are the people that you need to bring back out into the light. So, a lot of these things are misdiagnosed, a lot of these behaviors. And in the end, if someone doesn't understand that, there are resources out there for anybody, then typically, something's not going to be, they're not going to be heard, they're not going to be helped. People want to be heard, they want to be helped. So I guess, I would constantly preach to the fact that if people are seeing that there are red flags out there, or someone seems troubled or whatever, they need to try and do something, or at least heighten the awareness around that behavior, because that becomes concerning. There are other things that you could do in terms of tools. And EAP obviously is one of those things where every organization has, but they need to plug EAP into this directly and provide like a toolkit, stuff like that, which is what I've done in the past. But there are physical tools out there too that can help people in the physical environment, that you could turn a door into a wall, things like that. So, I just look at this holistically and see what else you could offer. But in my eyes, it's empowering people to be a voice for someone else if necessary.
Thank you. You used two initials, acronyms, so ICE. I have an emergency contact in my phone. In fact, I checked it. I did not have ICE in front of it. Does that stand for an acronym?
It does. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but yeah, it does.
It's in case of emergency, I think.
Yeah, I believe that's
Yes.
it. Yeah,
The obvious, Marie. Thank
yeah,
you.
too
And then you
obvious for me.
used one called IEP,
Oh, IED.
IED.
Yeah, those are secondary explosive devices.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and like pipe bombs, stuff like that people build.
Right. Thank you. This was very insightful. I appreciate this as we start off a new year, and I'm going to be teaching classes soon. And I just try to do it as an awareness piece. It's a behavior I picked up working at a utility company. It was always required of leaders in particular, but it is definitely an awareness, and people don't think about it. So thank you for giving me more knowledge and edifying me to be better as I try to continue to spread the awareness.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you, Ted.
morning.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you could stop the share, Ted, and we can see each other
Oh.
better.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jessica.
There we go.
I just want to say thank you as well. And thank you, Angie, for asking that question that you asked, because to be honest, I don't think that we've thought about that in a lot of the meetings and things that we go in. We talk about the exits, we talk about the restrooms and how to get to those, but thinking of things like these type of settings, unfortunately, is something that we do need to talk about and be prepared for. And Ted, I know you mentioned the malls, and it was crazy shopping this last Christmas, because I actually went to South Point Mall, and I know they had 2 shootings there. And right after we had just went to the mall, and not even thinking about it, having these conversations and thinking about that even being a possibility, and then feeling nervous after that. Wow, I'm glad we weren't there at that time, but what would we have done if we were? So thank you for talking and giving us some more information.
Thank you. It's a dark subject, but unfortunately, it comes down to saying something. See something, say something. You see it at the airport all the time. So we have to say something when we see something, and we have to be very vigilant in doing that. And people have to take it seriously. And now, obviously, we're in a world where when you do say something, it's going to be taken more seriously based off of past events.
Well, thank you, Ted. And you too, even if you are a member, will get this lovely certificate of appreciation. David will send it to you. But I think that we all appreciate this, and we need the reminders, even if we've heard some of this before. And it's amazing, honestly, how this sort of information comes at us in different ways. Ted and I serve on the board